evening. Tonight's story is a complicated one. It's a story of business, of questionable practices, of fraud involving millions and millions of pounds. It's the story of Bailieborough Co-op. 2 years ago, Bailieborough, one of Ireland's largest agribusiness companies, found itself in severe financial difficulties, and there began a 2-year takeover struggle which culminated in victory for the agribusiness king Larry Goodman. What we're going to do tonight is to look at some of the doubtful business practices operating in Bailieborough in the time leading up to its collapse. Bailieborough's involvement in a number of fraudulent transactions, including a huge EEC milk fraud where up to £7 million changed hands. Gary Agnew reports now on the rise and the fall of Bailieborough.
The cynics said it couldn't be done. In the heart of the hills of Cavan, on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by average farmland, where all the roads are minor. But still, it was done. The little dairy blossomed into one of the biggest co-ops in Ireland. Bailieborough was the co-op. The huge agribusiness became the town's lifeblood. But behind the scenes, a range of dubious business practices involving a number of the co-op's executives. A multi-million-pound smuggling operation. A huge fraud at the EEC's expense. Big subsidies were illegally obtained for milk products, supposedly fed to pigs, but in fact sold on for a tidy profit. At the centre of all of this, a bank account in Northern Ireland in a fictitious name. Through this account, huge sums changed hands in the illegal trading of milk products at the EEC's expense. For over 2 years, truckloads of milk products moved north and south of the border undetected. Money, too, moved north and south of the border in what was an elaborate cover-up for illegal trading. Meanwhile, back at the co-op, frauds too on computer equipment. Money paid out to non-existent suppliers for equipment that never turned up. Equipment supposed to have been bought in England, but a cheque was lodged in an account north of the border. Fictitious minutes of board meetings used to raise nearly £2 million unknown to the directors. 2 property deals in which Bailieborough got no property but lost nearly £300,000 just months before the collapse. Another £100,000 paid out in advance for a loan that never arrived. All but one of these deals unbeknownst to the chairman of the board or his co-directors. And a horse marketing venture in which £500,000 was lost to investors with the project still not off the ground. All of this in the few years just prior to Bailieborough's fall. The passing of the Land Act towards the end of the last century and the transfer of ownership of land from tenant to farmer created many changes in Irish agriculture. For the first time, farmers were their own masters. But there was a long road ahead to prosperity. This was one of the reasons which prompted Sir Horace Plunkett and others interested in improving the lot of the farmer to found the Irish cooperative movement. Bailieborough was one of the oldest co-ops in the country. It was started in 1902 at the old Millmount Dairy at Bailieborough, County Cavan. In the early part of the century, England was the main export market for Irish butter. However, because most farmers made their butter at home, packed it in firkins and sold it in the local market, Irish butter was of very variable quality and could not compete with Swedish or Danish butter on foreign markets. By 1950, supply of milk to the Bailieborough Creamery had reached 500,000 gallons, and by 1962, Bailieborough's milk supply had reached over 2 million gallons. But it was the appointment of Paddy O'Brien as general manager of the creamery in 1964 that marked the beginning of a new era for Bailieborough Co-op. Over the next 2 decades, he was to transform the Crossroads Creamery into a multi-million-pound food processing empire in the top 10 league of dairy cooperatives in Ireland. A major development in 1965 was the erection of a skim milk processing plant in a joint venture with McCormick Products. Up until then, most of the milk going into the creamery was used for the manufacture of butter. This separated the fat content of the milk, but left a huge byproduct, liquid skim milk, which previously had been used to feed pigs and calves. but the new skim milk processing plant dried the liquid into skim milk powder, for which there is a large and much more profitable market. In 1965, a site was purchased in Henry Street, Bailieborough, and the Co-op store was built for the sale of goods to members. In 1970, a store was opened in Drogheda. This led to a major increase in fertiliser sales and the start of bulk grain purchase by the group. New stores followed in Navan, Arva and Ballyhaise, bringing the number of Co-op stores to 7 in all. As milk supply increased dramatically, O'Brien was one of the first to introduce refrigerated bulk milk collection directly from the farmers. Loans were given to farmers to purchase additional cows. And as the EEC bonanza to milk producers took off in the early 70s, large suppliers received refrigerated storage tanks free of charge. The old laborious system of lifting and hauling cans of milk died away. The success of the farm tank scheme led to a decision to start a factory for the fabrication of stainless steel tanks. This new subsidiary, Bailieborough Cooperative Engineering, started up in 1974, manufacturing milk silos, bulk collection units and stainless steel containers for the food processing industry. In a few years, the engineering works was exporting 50% of its output. One of the most successful diversifications was the construction of a plant to manufacture Emmett's cream liqueur. It was a successful effort to copy the best-selling Bailey's cream. But Bailieborough had one major problem. It was in competition for milk supply with several other co-ops in the northeast. Bailieborough was fighting a milk war. The main contenders were Lochagish Co-op near Carrickmacross and Killashandra, the recent losers in Bailieborough's takeover, Virginia Milk Products, Bailieborough's nearest neighbour, and Monaghan Town Co-op. At that time, along came Alex McEntee, a local farmer and bon viveur, who teamed up with Paddy O'Brien to spearhead Bailieborough's aggressive drive to win that milk war. McEntee played it rough and rode the highways and byways, enticing hundreds of suppliers in neighbouring counties. His actual role at Bailieborough was never clearly defined. Employees variously described him as the minister without portfolio, the auctioneer, or just plain Sir Alec. He was heavily involved in the milk wars, particularly with Virginia.
When the going gets tough, the tough get going. And I would see that if Virginia tried to entice away some of our suppliers, we will have to devise a system or a scheme whereby we will be at least as good, if not better. And we're not worried, but I can see co-ops much more vulnerable than Bailieborough. For argument's sake, anybody that isn't in the liquid milk business and anyone hasn't a demand for milk such as we have for our Emmett's cream liqueur, they would be much more vulnerable, and I would see that potentially it could be dangerous.
One would have to accept that there was a certain flair of management which was growth orientated, and that this was perceived as being beneficial to the farmers in the area, which it was at the time. And I would suspect that yes, it arose from this flair.
It's not hard to find people who talk about milk wars and the management of this particular co-op being particularly good at them. Is that an element of the growth?
There's no question that the Bailieborough Cooperative in the period leading up to the difficulty had a reputation for being a very good predator, and had succeeded in convincing a number of farmers that they should switch to Bailieborough. Yes, that's true. Even ignoring the milk that had transferred into Bailieborough from other co-ops, individual farmers were expanding as well.
Bailieborough also developed a grain and milling business at Mulla, which helped to create a large market in animal feedstuffs. And the purchase of Owen's Dairies in County Meath enabled Bailieborough to increase its share of the liquid milk market. In all, it was a remarkable achievement by Paddy O'Brien. Faced in the early 80s with the new reality of EEC milk quotas and cutbacks in the Common Agricultural Policy, O'Brien successfully copper-fastened the loyalty of milk producers and developed new agribusiness outlets to protect the group from over-reliance on EEC subsidies. The figures speak for themselves. Milk intake grew from 25 million gallons in 1980 to 50 million gallons in 1984. Grain intake It grew from 2,000 tonnes in 1980 to 30,000 tonnes in 1984. Sales trebled from £25 million to £75 million by 1984. Profits too went up from £0.7 million in 1980 to £1.7 million by 1984. Assets went up from £8 million in 1980 to £30 million in 1984. The numbers employed at Bailieborough had reached an all-time high of 650 people. In 1985, the local Cavan newspaper, the Anglo-Celt, nominated a Leitrim man, Paddy O'Brien, as Cavan Man of the Year, and the Farmers' Journal awarded him the accolade of Agri-Businessman of the Year. Paddy O'Brien had arrived, seen here as host and chief sponsor of the International Cavan Song Contest. It's ironic that such accolades should fall on O'Brien just months before the co-op collapsed. But behind the scenes in all the accolades at Bailieborough Co-op, a series of sharp business practices took place over a number of years. And these reached their peak in the years of 1984 and 1985, when two senior executives at Bailieborough Co-op organised a multi-million-pound supply of illegal dairy products. Using a complex web of fictitious invoices and false bank accounts, over £6 million changed hands in two well-organised cross-border frauds. And the chief executive at the time, to this day, denies he had any knowledge of the following events. Dusk on the evening of April the 2nd, 1985. After weeks of surveillance and planning, the RUC fraud squad mounted a raid on a suspected EEC fraud. Two farmers from Cookstown were believed to be buying liquid skim milk for pig feed at a hugely subsidised rate. But they were suspected of not feeding it to pigs, instead selling it on for a tidy profit. Using a converted petrol tanker, over 5 million litres of milk illegally changed hands. And this profitable sideshow came to an end the night the RUC moved in. The milk was purchased at Dunman Bridge Creamery. It was driven to this yard, where it was left for collection. But the RUC had forensically marked the batch of April the 2nd. They followed the tanker along its 70-mile journey from Cookstown to Irvinstown, just north of Enniskillen. As the previously marked milk was being unloaded at West Ulster Farmers Co-op, the RUC moved in. The driver was arrested. The farmers who supplied it were arrested. The co-op's accounts and books were seized. The chief executive of the creamery which received the illegal milk was arrested on his return from a business trip to Japan. He was taken in for questioning. Jim Hamilton admitted he was buying the milk, which he said he badly needed to keep production going. It was the North's Milk Marketing Board who were first alerted to the fraud. They'd no idea the milk they sold to farmers was not being fed to pigs.
That milk actually originated in a board-owned creamery at Dunman Bridge. That creamery at that time was selling milk to farmers in the area for stock feed under an EC stock feed scheme. And the milk was coming from our own creamery.
And where was it supposed to be going to, and where did it end up going to?
It was supposed to be going to farmers in the area for animal feed, but our investigations suggested to us that some of the milk was not ending up on at least two of the farms. And because we had those suspicions, we immediately notified the Department of Agriculture. In fact, we notified the Department of Agriculture on Tuesday, the 30th of January. They in turn notified the Intervention Board, who are responsible for the scheme, and they in turn called in the police to investigate.
West Ulster Farmers Cooperative is in Irvinstown, 6 miles north of Enniskillen. In recent years, the co-op has undergone significant expansion. Its main product is casein, a dried high-protein dairy product made from liquid skim milk. Jim Hamilton undertook an aggressive sales drive, but this left him with more markets than he had casein. He had one big problem: not enough liquid skim milk, especially in winter time. Traditionally, this co-op closes for 6 to 8 weeks at Christmas, and Hamilton was anxious to take milk wherever he could get it. As a result of this successful raid, the RUC uncovered something much bigger and something quite different to what they originally thought. This co-op, who were in receipt of the illegally obtained milk, had never heard of the farmers who supplied it, nor had any dealings with them. And the farmers themselves didn't know that their illegally obtained milk ended up here. It turned out that the answer to this confusing riddle came from south of the border. West Ulster Farmers Co-op dealt with two principals from the south. Both principals were employees of Bailieborough Co-op. This Bailieborough connection came as a surprise to the RUC. They had no idea about it during their investigations. It turned out that Alex McEntee of Bailieborough approached Jim Hamilton and set up the deal for the supply of illegal liquid skim. With him was John Rooney, the number 2 at Bailieborough, who went with McEntee to set the deal up. And Eamon Oliver Plunkett McCardle, a haulier who did quite a lot of work for Bailieborough. And he was the front man in moving the skim milk and arranging the payments for the farmers.
When the police came in, we cooperated fully with them in their investigation. And I was led to understand that milk did move to Irvinstown. There was also some indication of a connection with a creamery in the Republic of Ireland, but I was never told the details of that.
To recap, Dunman Bridge Creamery, owned by the Milk Marketing Board, thought they were selling subsidised skim milk to local farmers as pig feed. In fact, it was being illegally transported cross-country to Jim Hamilton at West Ulster Farmers in Enniskillen. But the deal to sell to West Ulster Farmers was set up by two Bailieborough executives, Alex McEntee and John Rooney. The milk was purchased from Dunman Bridge Creamery for 6p a gallon. Its true market value was 40p a gallon. The EEC subsidy, which was being ripped off, was 34 pence a gallon. Between August 1983 and April 1985, 13 million litres were sold to West Ulster farmers for a cost of £1 million sterling. Nobby Coyle is the former bank manager at the Bank of Ireland Irvinstown, where much of the business dealings were done.
Nobby Coyle, when did you first have dealings with Bailieborough and with Alex McEntee?
I was approached by the management of the West Ulster Farmers, who asked me would I facilitate a customer who was coming to them with certain banking arrangements. And because they were such good customers of the bank, I facilitated them.
And who did you deal with?
Alex McEntee.
And what was your understanding of his position?
My understanding was that he was an agent for Bailieborough Co-op, who were creating some transactions with the West Ulster Farmers.
Well, what was your understanding of the business arrangements and transactions going on between West Ulster and Mr. McEntee?
My understanding was that they were purchasing super levy milk in the border area and selling it to the West Ulster Farmers cooperative movement.
Was there a substantial amount of business going on?
There was indeed, yeah.
And substantial sums of money changing hands?
Correct.
Alex McEntee told West Ulster farmers that to cover the deal from his end, he would have to present false supplier invoices. West Ulster farmers agreed to play along. Their sole interest was getting their hands on the valuable liquid skim milk. Once a month, Alex McEntee would arrive from Bailieborough. He would present Jim Hamilton with a false invoice. The amount of milk and the price would be correct. The name of the supplier on the invoice would be one of two names: Eamon McCardle and Sons, the name of the haulier who transported the illegal milk, and J. Duffy and Sons, Main Street, Ballyracket. J. Duffy and Sons does not exist. Once West Ulster farmers were satisfied they were paying only for what they got, they agreed to make the cheques payable to the name on the invoice. But this payment was always handed to Alex McEntee, who then went to the Bank of Ireland in Irvinstown. The illegal payments over the 18-month period were substantial. J. Duffy and Sons, they were paid £318,000. E. McCardle, £633,000. But all this money was in fact received by Alex McEntee and then banked into a fictitious account from which the various illegal suppliers and McCardle the haulier were paid their cut. As a result of this successful RUC raid, there were convictions north of the border. including the farmers who supplied the milk. Victor McRae was fined £25,000. James Howard, a former DUP councillor, and his son, fined £5,000. Also charged, Eamon Oliver Plunkett McCardle, the haulier. He was fined £25,000. Not long after Alex McEntee and Eamon McCardle began to supply West Ulster farmers, McEntee asked Jim Hamilton to enter into what he called a contra payments exercise, a money laundering operation. In effect, West Ulster farmers were asked to falsely invoice Bailieborough Co-op. In other words, to appear on paper as suppliers to Bailieborough, not recipients from them. Hamilton, anxious to keep up his milk supply, agreed. And so West Ulster farmers falsely invoiced Bailieborough as suppliers of liquid skim milk, milk which it never actually supplied. And Bailieborough did pay West Ulster farmers from the Northern Bank account in Bailieborough town. So they paid West Ulster farmers for goods they never got. But the money paid to West Ulster farmers was laundered out the back door, back to Alex McEntee, who had an account at the local Bank of Ireland in Irvinstown, where much of the laundered money ended up.
What was your understanding of Mr. A. McNamee?
He originally approached me as A. McNamee, but it subsequently transpired that he was in fact A. McEntee.
So the bank account in Irvinstown in the name of A. McNamee was in fact a bank account in the control of Alex McEntee?
That is correct, yeah.
And were there substantial payments made into that account?
There were indeed, yeah.
So, West Ulster farmers appear on paper as big suppliers to Bailieborough. Over a 12-month period, West Ulster farmers supplied invoices claiming they were big suppliers of milk and butter, thus covering Bailie-Borough's operations on paper. But in fact, no goods were ever supplied. All the traffic was one way. Destination, West Ulster farmers, Irvinstown. Over a 12-month period, a total of £1.08 million was laundered out of Bailieborough on the strength of invoices from West Ulster farmers. But that money ended up in Alex McEntee's false account in Irvinstown.
Looking back now, what is your understanding of what was going on and how do you feel about it?
Well, following the disclosure of the information that you now have provided me with, if I had known then what I know now, I certainly would not have had any hand, act or part with the opening of those accounts or the transaction that took place. But it's easier to be wiser in hindsight, I suppose.
Our investigations reveal that this is very much the smaller of two cross-border frauds, but the second has all the hallmarks of the first. Once again, a dairy north of the border is involved. Again, false invoices and bogus suppliers. And again, many of the same players. The difference this time is the product and the sheer scale of the fraud. The product was dried skim milk powder, and the fraud valued at some £5 million. It was John Rooney who contacted Golden Cow, offering skim milk powder for sale. Golden Cow distribute butter under their trade name all across the 6 counties. But they were interested in getting their hands on skim milk powder. They didn't want it for themselves, they were acting as agents. The buyer was in Holland, Nico Sibbing Milk Products, and they were willing to pay top price for the skim milk powder. In late 1984, Jack Clark at Golden Cow contacted John Rooney by telex, confirming a buyer. This is the best offer we have to date. Can your contact supply? John Rooney at Bailieborough responded with the price, £959 sterling a tonne, packaged in 5-ply polylined bags, unmarked. The deal was on, and over a 2-year period, some 3,000 tonnes of skim milk powder was to change hands. That's 150 truckloads. So on the face of it, a straightforward deal between two co-ops. But Bailey Foods, 50% owned by McCormick's, which manufactures skim milk powder at Bailieborough, has an exclusive contract with Bord Bainne, to whom it is obliged to supply all its output. We have been told by them that at no stage did they ever supply any skim milk powder to Golden Cow. Yet over a 2-year period, following John Rooney's agreement to supply Golden Cow, some 3,000 tonnes did change hands at a cost of just £3 million. We now know that the skim milk powder did not come from Bailey Foods. So who exactly was that external source referred to in the telexes setting up the deal? Who was behind the deal? And how did they get their hands on 5,000 tons of skim milk powder without the authorities knowing about it? Just where did the skim milk powder come from? In October 1984, a company called Abervale was set up in Dublin at Mill Lane, Palmerston. Its purpose was to buy skim milk powder out of intervention in order to denature the powder, making it fit only for animal feeds. This denaturing process involves the adding of certain mineral products, making it unfit for human consumption. The EEC give a substantial subsidy for this operation. In this way, they can reduce the size of the milk powder mountain by encouraging the sale of the powder for animal feed. The normal commercial price for pure skim milk powder at the time Abervale was set up was around £1,000 a tonne. But if bought for denaturing purposes, it could be got for £300 a tonne. Thus, the EEC subsidy paid out was £700 a tonne. Abervale in Dublin bought 5,000 tonnes out of intervention and set up their denaturing process. Under the rules, this process is certified by Department of Agriculture officials. Today Tonight decided to investigate the principles behind Abervale and who they sold their powder to.